I thought I would just share a thought that I have had recently about energy issues in general. And it was particularly prompted by an experience I had yesterday. There's a professor named Joseph Dancy, whom I met several years ago when I was doing a speaking engagement in Dallas, Texas, and I spoke at SMU, Southern Methodist University. And I think I was there at the, in particular at the Perot Museum, which is a really, really impressive museum that was one of the main benefactors and initiators of it, or at least of its major upgrade, is a guy named Forrest Hoagland, who's a really, really cool guy. He's in his 80s and is just incredibly sharp guy, is a model of ambition and energy and just the physical sense for anyone. Anyway, I was there giving an engagement. I met this guy, Joseph Dancy, and he was an impressive guy and knew a lot and was enthusiastic about my work. And recently, he told me that he was now at the University of Oklahoma and he had a really interesting, I believe it's a law school class, and they didn't have any kind of budget, but he asked me would I do a remote presentation. So I decided to do a remote presentation because I remember him fondly and it seemed like he was doing really good work. So we decided to do a Q&A type format. He ended up asking me a bunch of questions. And one thing I was curious about what would happen is how would my answers to these questions differ from answers I might have given 6 months or a year ago, particularly in light of all the thinking I've been doing for the moral case for fossil fuels 2.0, which I'm still actively in the middle of. And it was interesting that there's one issue in particular that kept coming up, and I just thought I'd share it with you because it's for me one of the most fundamentally clarifying thoughts that I've ever had, and it's not a new thought, but it's the thought that keeps on giving. And one way to put this thought is that nature does not give us the environment we need to flourish. Nature does not give us the environment we need to flourish. A couple things about this idea. One is that it's a fundamental idea about how the world works. It's saying that, well, one thing is we want to flourish. That's a goal that we're paying attention to. So we want to succeed in life materially and mentally. But that's not the default. It's not that Mother Nature is conspiring to help us. Now, obviously, nature is the precondition of flourishing, and nature has amazing potential. But that potential needs to be activated and actualized by something. And this view is very much in contrast to the normal way we're taught to think about environment, which is that nature gives us a perfect environment. One thing I've observed in talking about different issues, and in particular, I'm working on the environment sections of the moral case for fossil fuels, is whether you're talking about the issue of air quality or water quality or resource availability or even wildlife. They only think of industry as something that can negatively impact those. They treat them as, oh, well, air quality is perfect without humans. Water quality is perfect. Resources are abundant. Wildlife is perfect. And that informs a whole attitude toward industry, which is that industry can only do negative things environmentally, and it cannot do positive things. The best it can do is to not have an impact. And that's the idea, although not the reality behind something like green energy. It's allegedly natural. It somehow doesn't impact nature, which is an impossible thing if you're dealing with energy, because energy is a transformative force. But the idea at least is, well, you're minimizing your impact on environment. But the reason that's a plausible idea is because environment is perceived as perfect. But once we, from a human flourishing perspective, realize that environment is deeply imperfect, that it does not satisfy the basic requirement of giving us what we need to flourish, then our attitude toward environmental issues changes, because our focus then becomes, what can we do to change the environment, to make it a place where we can flourish? And then you look at, say, water quality, and you see, oh, well, yeah, water isn't plentifully available and clean just by default. So then we need to intelligently transform nature to, say, purify water that isn't drinkable and then move water that's far away to a close location. So there's an enormous potential for environmental improvement. Or in the realm of climate, nature doesn't give us, as I'll often say, a safe climate that we then make dangerous. It gives us a dangerous climate that we need to make safe. So then we need to think about, okay, how do we master our climate? How do we create a human indoor climate that we can live in most of the time, where we're insulated from the temperature extremes that exist just about anywhere? That's a huge kind of thing. How do we protect ourselves from the storms that exist just about anywhere? How do we, with water, I mentioned, how do we protect ourselves from drought, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? We need to, all of these areas of life, we need to master or improve our environment. And we can really think of this as a perspective that involves everything in life, because in a sense, you can think of everything as it's you and then your environment. So even your perspective on energy, when people talk about the when I noticed when I was talking about energy, one of the fundamental points is that nature doesn't give us the energy resources that we need to flourish. It gives us the potential, it gives us raw energy, but then we need a process to transform that raw energy into cheap, plentiful, reliable, usable energy for all sorts of different applications. And because I have this perspective that nature doesn't give us the environment we need to flourish, I'm always in my thinking, I'm always factoring in the need to do something positive to our environment to transform it. And then when I look at the different ways in which we transform our environment through industry, I'm looking not just for negatives, I'm looking overwhelmingly for positives. So, for example, let's take something I've been thinking a lot about: air quality recently. And air quality might be the thing where you think, oh, well, that's one where we only make it worse, but definitely not true. Think about the state of the air that nature gives us. Well, the default is actually that it's full of biological pollution, which is the worst kind of pollution. Pollution, as in just contaminants from a human perspective. We have the pollution of diseases, airborne diseases that are passed on by our waste, by animal waste, that and so there's the perspective of these different, and it's not just like smoke, which can damage us in certain ways, but smoke isn't trying to hurt us. These biological organisms are actually trying to hurt us. Their survival, their flourishing actually conflicts with our flourishing. They're not actually trying to hurt us, but there is a direct conflict of interest in a different way from smoke, which has no interest. So it's interesting that actually, the air that other people were breathing was not at all conducive to them flourishing, because it had all of these different hostile organisms in it. And then also internally, we had a bad situation because we weren't able to protect ourselves from those organisms. Whereas now, not only have we gotten rid of some of those organisms in our environment, but we also have created technology to neutralize those kinds of things. So you think about different kinds of diseases, like, if you have even if the polio vaccine had somehow created more polio molecules, so to speak, molecules isn't the right term, but like polio organisms in the world, you'd still have a better environment from a human perspective, because you would have the technology to deal with polio. And it's a similar climate mastery has strong analogies to vaccination, because the more that you can master climate, the more that anything that happens in your environment that was dangerous several hundred years ago is trivial today. Sometimes I'll use the example of a thunderstorm that would have wrecked a village several hundred years ago can now be the setting for a romantic date with a couple, because we've so mastered climate using superior technology. So I just find over and over and over as just this fundamental ingredient of thinking that if you recognize nature doesn't give us the environment we need to flourish, it will help illuminate all of these different issues, from the need for a really efficient process to produce usable energy, which goes into all the fallacies behind green energy, which hasn't yet figured out a resource efficient process to give us cheap, plentiful, reliable, versatile energy. like it goes all the way from that to how you think about air quality, to how you think about climate, to how you think about even wildlife, like wildlife, the state of wildlife. This is a whole involved issue, but yeah, that's not naturally ideal. I mean, for one, it's naturally threatening. So we want to think about how can we intelligently transform this. It doesn't mean that we've done all of these ideally, but fundamentally industry in the sense of the mass deployment of machines to transform our environment, that is a fundamentally positive environmental force. And I almost never meet anyone in industry who has that perspective. But I think if they keep clear on this idea that nature doesn't give us the environment we need to flourish, it will just dramatically change their perception of what they do. And it should change everyone's perception of every policy decision. Because when we think about anything related to environment and we look at choices to make, particularly restrictive choices, we always need to look at not only how does this lessen some man-made threat to our environment, but also how might this lessen some man-made benefit to our environment. And in general, there are many more man-made benefits to our environment than man-made threats. So that's my big thought. Either of you have anything to chime in on that one?
Well, yes. So just think about how many hours a modern human would survive in a truly natural environment. I think that's a good reference point.
How
So
many?
not many, I guess. So just a threat from other species. Like I live in Europe, and Europe would be a forest full of bears and other big animals that would probably kill me within an hour.
In California, I think it was in California, there was a mountain lion attack. And I've talked to my girlfriend about how I believe that if I was attacked by a mountain lion, I would have a fighting chance because I would strangle it because I do Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And in fact, this guy, I believe he was trained in Jiu Jitsu, he strangled this mountain lion. So I found that pretty vindicating. And it actually occurred to me, jiu-jitsu schools should really teach you much more about how to fight animals. That seems like a really good use case, like if you're attacked by a pit bull or you're attacked by a mountain lion or attacked by a bear. So I'm wondering, there's a new niche for somebody to pioneer, and I will buy your instructional.